time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Lee Colleton and David Robinson. Lee Colleton and David Robinson are both with the Seattle Privacy Coalition. Thank you both for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us on again. We're happy to come in here and give you an occasional update, and there's always some crazy news going on.
There is, and in fact, the reason I dragged you in at this hour this morning. So tell us a little bit about the Seattle Privacy Coalition.
Okay, we were founded in 2013 during the controversy over the port security cameras, so-called, that popped up along Alki Beach and the waterfront in downtown Seattle and elsewhere. And as a result of that, a lot of activists got together from all political stripes and were trying to get information from the city as to who these cameras belong to, what they were there for, where the money for them had come from, why there had been no public announcement or debate or anything else. And so that's the circumstances under which we got together. We're now official. We're a nonprofit organization under Washington law, and you can see our site seattleprivacy.org for information, and you can contact us if you want to get on our mailing list. But anyway, the result of those cameras going up was a public outcry. The city council passed an ordinance 124142, which was supposed to block any such incidents from happening again, so that any new surveillance equipment was required under that ordinance to be approved beforehand by the city council and the mayor's office. And sure enough, the cameras and the radio network that was associated with them has never been operated. It's never been turned on properly. And so all of that has been sitting in limbo now for 2.5 years. The problem with that ordinance, though, is that several other surveillance measures have gone into place since then, and the thing's not really been enforced. It's not been implemented. On the bright side, there is a process underway in the city to create a toolkit that all city departments will use anytime they do work with technology that has a privacy impact. That's grinding its way slowly through City Hall, and we're hoping to see that released within a month or so. But until then, the unfortunate fact is that we have a law in the books that really has had one success, which is to keep those cameras that were put up secretly. It's kept them from working, but there are many other things like the police face recognition systems, the license plate reading, various kinds of things that seriously impact privacy of individuals who are certainly not criminals, and these are things that really concern us.
So this week, the tail end of this week, there was multiple media reports about ATF cameras that had been spotted in the city, and in fact, the person that had spotted those was you, Lee. You discovered both of them. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So those cameras, or the first camera that I saw, both of them look very similar. They have the same enclosure. It's this sort of white boxy enclosure for the camera with a dome on the bottom for the actual camera to look through. But the equipment is housed in this white boxy enclosure made by a company called DotWorks, the Z at the end. And so they have this distinctive look to them, and I'd gone along the waterfront photographing the other cameras to make sure that we knew where all of them were and where all of them were pointing. There's one of the cameras was across from the aquarium, which I found ridiculous. It has no view of the water, but it's supposed to be there for port security. And so I'm familiar with the existing or the previously existing cameras. So when I saw this one up on the pole, there was this flash of recognition where I looked at it and I thought, wait a minute, is this another Seattle police camera that's been put in? And I first noticed it while I was on a march that was in solidarity with the people who were killed in Charleston, the Charleston 9. And we had gone starting from the first AME church on Capitol Hill and marched along 23rd under the view of one of the cameras that I didn't see at the time. But then when we turned onto Jackson off of 23rd, right by the Starbucks, between that and a Walgreens, up on a Seattle City light pole, there was this camera, and I looked at it and thought that it might be another Seattle police camera, and so I photographed it with my phone, and then also took a picture of the Seattle City light pole tag with the number on it designating, that this pole was a property of the city, and I tweeted those out to the Seattle police and Mike Wagers, who I had just seen at the start of the march, so I knew he was there and had his phone on him. And I didn't receive a reply. And a week later, I replied to my own tweet trying to get more attention to it. And I did that for a few weeks. And after about a month, I did get a reply from Seattle Police saying, "This is not our equipment." And then another reply shortly thereafter from Seattle City Light saying, "Well, this isn't ours either, and we're going to look into it." And that's when things got really interesting, because if there's a camera on the pole that Seattle City Light doesn't know about, then why is it there? So I went back this last Friday, so not yesterday, but the week prior, and brought along a pocket telescope and gave the camera a close inspection, and I noticed a phone number on the side of it. And it turns out that phone number points to a Todd E. Reeves, who has a LinkedIn profile that if you Googled this phone number in Seattle, that would come up. And he lists himself as, or had listed himself as, the surveillance expert for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And this is sort of a public secret, I think. I'm not sure that anyone else had noticed that phone number on the side of the camera and made that connection and then announced that. But I figured that would be the right thing to do, because I hadn't heard about this sort of program. There was a mention in the Seattle Times. There was a press conference, rather, that happened a week after that march, where I noticed this camera, that discussed a collaboration between the ATF and the Seattle police in examining the ballistics, the shell casings from shells found at crime scenes to try and identify the guns that had been used in those crimes, and some success there where they had traced a gun that had been used in multiple crimes over the past few years and apprehended someone and had some success there. But that was an opportunity where the mayor and the chief of police and other members of the community who were calling for these cameras there at that press conference, I think it was on the 14th or thereabouts, if they had known about these cameras, they could have then said, well, actually, we are putting these cameras up in the community. But instead, they just said that they were open to the possibility of having cameras. And so this is a problem either way, whether they knew about it and didn't say anything, or whether they didn't know about it and Seattle City Light is acting in service of the ATF without following up their chain of accountability to the mayor and to city council, letting them know that surveillance equipment is being installed in the city contrary to our privacy initiative, and in fact contrary to the recognition of, we had recently had the city council and the mayor declare that all Seattle citizens have a right to privacy as recognized by the United Nations Charter for Human Rights. And so particularly when I saw this camera on the 7th, I was thinking about the surveillance of people in the Black Lives Matter movement. And that came out recently in The Intercept, where through some Freedom of Information Act requests, it was found that the Department of Homeland Security, a different federal agency, was closely monitoring people who were active in social media and active in these movements, even when they were not suspected of doing anything illegal at all, that their locations were being tracked, their postings online were being tracked, and that's a clear echo of the counterintelligence program against people in the previous civil rights movement, the era of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's what I was thinking about when I first saw the camera.
And the ATF would fall under the umbrella of Department of Homeland Security, though?
No.
No?
Oh, are
No,
they
it's
not?
it's
The
under
Commerce Department?
No, it's Department of Justice.
Oh, okay.
You had mentioned that originally when you had started looking into this that you had tweeted Mike Wagers. Who would that be?
Oh, he's the CTO of Seattle Police. He would be the person in charge of procuring surveillance cameras or any other equipment.
Okay. So you eventually the media started picking this up and having, well, you had actually at first attempted to contact the phone number. Did you gain any knowledge from what happened there? Or is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, so it was an interesting conversation. That was my first response when I saw this number. I thought naively perhaps, well, I'll just give this a call and ask why this camera is here. And I called and asked who I was speaking to, and they declined to identify themselves. And they asked who I was, and I said that I was a citizen of the city of Seattle and concerned about that neighborhood. And it is where one of my sons goes to school. And so they declined to state what the camera was there for. And I asked them about it and said, this is attached to a city light pole, and that I would figure out eventually who it belonged to. And I hadn't actually done the search on the phone number at that point. That was actually pointed out to me by a stranger reporter shortly thereafter, that maybe I should have done that first. But anyway, I asked them why this camera was here, and eventually they came around to say that perhaps it was due to the shootings and crime in that neighborhood, which presumably this is part. And Brian Bennett, an officer from the ATF, or an agent from the ATF, later sent in an email that is exactly why the cameras is supposed to be there, as part of a anti-gang activity between the ATF, the King County Sheriff's Department, and the King County Department of Corrections. So it doesn't necessarily involve the Seattle Police, and I suppose it's possible that they didn't know anything about it. But then still, because it was installed by Seattle City Light, there's that chain of accountability. But yeah, so after ending that conversation, I started contacting reporters. Eventually, there was a story in Crosscut, and then a story in The Stranger, and then it was picked up by the Seattle Times through the Associated Press, and Kiro 7 did a news interview and a news piece on it, and then King 5 News aired something yesterday about it.
So it still seems hazy as to Seattle City Light's role in all this, depending on which article you read.
It seems less hazy than it was. I think it was in the Seattle Times article, the spokesman for Seattle City Light acknowledged that the cameras had been put up there with the knowledge of Seattle City Light. This is after they first said they didn't know anything about it and they would check. Well, after checking, it turns out, of course, they did know about it. And in fact, the spokesperson said, "We support law enforcement, and we will continue to do so and put further equipment of this sort up as needed." So, because we in the public noticed these things and pursued it and actually did some digging, what it looks like the stonewalling that Seattle City Light initially tried on us failed. Also, the police department, it's unlikely that if they're part of this anti-gang task force that they're not aware that there's surveillance going on down there. So they've now essentially admitted that they're involved in this, even if they have clean hands by not having actually climbed up the pole and installed it. But so that's all pretty typical. But what astonishes me is that you have Seattle City Light supposedly making policy about privacy issues in this town, making private deals or at that level with police agencies from the federal government, and completely bypassing any city process, and maybe even bypassing the Seattle Police Department. Though I don't want to let them off the hook on this. So Seattle City Light is now setting law enforcement cooperation policies and setting privacy policies in Seattle. I don't really think that's possible. If it is, then that's a serious failure of the city government, the city bureaucracy, to be managed properly. So I would like to see the mayor's office explaining what is going on here and what the relationship is between the political leadership and the bureaucracy in City Hall, and what's happening on the streets, and what their relations are with the federal government in this. And as a general matter, the issue here isn't really whether it's good or not that the ATF is trying to fight crime by putting cameras up. We could have that debate, and I hope we would debate it on the basis of actual evidence, and whether cameras like that help in the general reduction of crime, whether they had a specific investigative reason for putting them up, and so on. But the real problem here is that there's no process. There's no public debate. We have laws in place. We have, a law in place in Seattle that should have been looked to when these cameras were put up. And I understand that, the federal government doesn't really need to pay attention to that sort of thing, but there's also something seriously wrong when you have sort of free agents happening at the level of the local electric utility deciding what's going to happen.
And the poles are the exclusive domain of Seattle City Light. Is that correct?
They each have a serial number on them. It says Seattle City Light. Nobody else can touch those poles.
So if you or I were to try and put something up on a pole, we'd probably
I think that probably would be trespassing.
Particularly if we wired it into their electrical system, then that would be theft of electricity.
Yeah. Which, of course, they've admitted that they let them do it. But we couldn't do that.
So far, we just know that there are 2. Is it possible there's more?
There could be more. The ATF is refusing to confirm or deny, based on the fact that there were 2 hotspots noted in that Seattle Times article about the joint task force, gang task force. I'm going to take a look down at the other hotspot, which is down in the southern end of Rainier Valley, and this weekend, if I get down there, and see if I can find some more. I'd bet you better than even money that I'll find something down there.
And Seattle Privacy Coalition on your website, seattleprivacy.org, has a nice map.
We have a nifty map which I maintain, and so the 2 Central District cameras are now on there, and I keep that up. That started as a map of all the mesh nodes, the radio communication system that was connected to these cameras. All the original cameras, they're all up there. There's like 20 cameras that were part of that Seattle Police Department effort 2.5 years ago, and about 80 mesh nodes. There's a lot of them. So, so that's all on there. Take a look at the SeattlePrivacy.org site if you want to see where the camera nearest you is.
And particularly if you see something interesting up on a pole or in your neighborhood, please contact us. We have contact information on our website, which I'm trying to find. Do you happen to know what our email address is off the top of your head?
The general email address is contact@seattleprivacy.org.
Okay.
You can reach us that way. If you have a tip, if you see a camera that you can't figure out, let us know. Cameras on private buildings, generally we assume those are private, and we don't track those right now. That would be such a huge project. But we're interested in cameras that are going up with public money, and we want to make sure that there's a public debate about them, whether they should be there or not. Because each one of those cameras compromises personal privacy in the name of some goal which may or may not be, served by them, but they should be discussed. They shouldn't be secret. And if you have like an active investigation going on, maybe that doesn't need to be publicized, but it certainly needs to be properly managed through the city, and it should be in accordance with the laws of the city.
So far, the mayor's office hasn't responded on this. City council responded to this?
We haven't approached them directly. We've just sort of tweeted annoying tweets at them. So nothing yet, but we've got quite an agenda next week to follow up on all of this. We need to find out if we can get some comment. Actually, we would very much like to sit down with the mayor or the mayor's staff and have a general discussion about these matters, because so far we really haven't done that.
But Bruce Harrell's office has weighed in a bit?
Bruce Harrell's office has weighed in, and he doesn't know what's going on, which is a very bad sign, and I'm sure he's not happy. But we'll be waiting to hear more from him. He was quoted in some of those articles saying that he wasn't aware of this, and he'd be looking into it.
And Bruce Harrell is the chair of the Public Safety, Technology, and Civil Rights Committee of the city.
And he has been very very active in a leadership role in these privacy initiatives. The human privacy as a human right resolution, the General Privacy Initiative. As head of that committee, he's done a lot of good work. He and Mike O'Brien are the people spearheading that. Although we should give credit back to Nick Licata 2.5 years ago for putting forward the original ordinance under which all this is operating.
So another piece of information that the ATF has stated is that the cameras are not doing live feeds. They're just dumping the information to a hard drive.
Right. That was the term that they gave, was this is an incident-based surveillance system. So presumably, if there's an incident, then they'll either go up, and if the hard drive is there inside of the camera, they'll pull it out and look over the information stored, or if it is connecting over a network, then they would pour through the video recordings. And this is another point, is that so it's sort of two-sided. There have been calls by members of the community and aspiring politicians to have more surveillance for the sake of deterrence. And a deterrent surveillance system will only work if people know about it. And so that conflicts with the objective of having a covert surveillance system that can monitor people where they're unaware that they're being recorded. And the other part that I was going to say, but anyway, this incident-driven system may not be actively monitored. It may just be dumping to a hard drive in the same way that the port surveillance system that was put in previously with federal money, that from the Department of Homeland Security, wasn't going to be something that was actively monitored. It would just wait until there was terrorists speeding into Elliott Bay on their Zodiac boats, and then be turned on to protect the city. That was the reason behind having this port security system, is to protect our maritime domain.
Well, one thing we're interested in is what's going to happen to these task force cameras, ATF cameras, when the investigation is over. We'd like to see them come down, and we'd like to see, or else see a debate about whether they should stay up. And so that's one thing that we'll be expecting to engage in with them, with the authorities and the city government later. We want to make sure that cameras don't just sort of get glued permanently to the public space and have no debate about that. We don't want to end up like London. My daughter lives in London right now, and everything I'd ever heard about the level of surveillance camera saturation over there is true. And one of my personal reasons for being interested in these issues is because I also was a fellowship recipient 30 years ago in East Germany. I was a Fulbrighter there, and I lived in East Berlin. The first time I saw public surveillance cameras, the long sort of boxy tube type ones, pointed out over a public square was in East Germany 30 years ago. And now all I have to do is look around Seattle, and they're everywhere. That keeps me pretty focused on the dangers of this.
And there are rules around the Department of Transportation cameras. The Seattle Department of Transportation has cameras that are specifically for the purpose of monitoring traffic, and they have them at nearly every intersection. There's also a license plate recording system that is specifically for the purpose of timing how long it takes to get from one part of the city to the other, so that SDOT is able to figure out where there's traffic jams and look at trends and all of that. Those cameras are not to be used for law enforcement, even like finding stolen vehicles or Amber Alerts or any of that. There's a prohibition on those cameras' use for law enforcement purposes. So if you go out and you suddenly start seeing all of these cameras at every intersection, know that many of them are merely there for monitoring traffic. And there was a debate about this when those went up, about the potential risk of setting up this surveillance system throughout the city, and that's why the Seattle Department of Transportation cameras have a limited resolution when you're looking at them online. You can't pick out people's faces, or the license plate system doesn't expose any of that information. It's just looking at the timings from one plate going to another camera.
Because I read in other municipalities they have some systems that also photograph the drivers and passengers now.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
So, just under 2 minutes left. Lee, you had said before we went on the air about another movement tied to the Black Lives Matter movement that was significant to this.
Yeah, I think that the United Hoods movement was it was interesting. I read this in the Seattle Weekly. There was an article about the effort of Seattle gangs to come together and find or broker a peace, because they recognize that there's also this problem with violence perpetuated by the status quo, and they're interested in changing it. I don't know too much about that, and that's something that might be interesting for further explorations. Certainly, if anyone in the United Hoods movement wants to send us an email, that's contact@seattleprivacy.org. Let us know what you think about the cameras.
All right. So we're just about out of time. Again, how can people find out more about the Seattle Privacy Coalition?
Take a look at our website, which is www.seattleprivacy.org. And you can write us at contact@seattleprivacy.org.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you both for coming and spending time with us this morning.
All right.
Thanks for having us.